History is messy, full of twists, turns, and unexpected moments. It's rarely a neat story, and the birth of America was no exception. The story of America's beginnings is a tale of ambition, conflict, and transformation. Before the United States existed, there were 13 British colonies like moody teenagers living far from home, each with their own quirks and dreams. For decades, things were relatively relaxed. The colonies thrived, exporting goods and building communities. Britain got its share of wealth, and most people on both sides of the Atlantic were content with the arrangement. But as the colonies grew, they started to see themselves differently. They weren't just transplanted Brits anymore. They were becoming something new, Americans, with their own customs, values, and sense of possibility. This new sense of identity was quietly simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite into something bigger. That moment came after the French and Indian War, a brutal, expensive conflict that left Britain deep in debt and searching for ways to recover. Britain turned to its colonies, expecting them to help pay the bill for a war fought on their soil, even though the colonists hadn't asked for it. Suddenly, the colonies felt like their parent was changing the rules, demanding more money, more obedience, and more control over their daily lives. It wasn't just about taxes or money, it was about respect, partnership, and the right to have a voice in decisions that affected their future. The colonists resented being treated like a piggy bank, not a partner. They wanted to be heard, not just taxed. This shift in attitude set the stage for a massive, messy family feud, one that would change the course of history. The colonies wanted a say in their own affairs, a chance to shape their own destiny, and to be treated as equals. And that's how the seeds of revolution were planted, by ordinary people who dared to imagine a different future, and who were willing to fight for it. After the costly French and Indian War, Britain started sending bills to the American colonies. First came the Sugar Act, a tax on sugar and molasses that hit merchants and rum makers hard. The British government argued these taxes were fair, since the war had been fought partly to protect the colonies, but then came the infamous Stamp Act, which took things to a whole new level. The Stamp Act taxed almost every piece of paper, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards and dice. Suddenly, everyday life in the colonies was affected, and people felt the pinch in their wallets. Colonists were furious, not just because of the taxes themselves, but because they had no say in Parliament. They believed it was unfair to be taxed by a government across the ocean, with no colonial representatives to speak for them. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry, echoing through town meetings, newspapers, and protests. They organized protests, boycotted British goods, and formed groups like the Sons of Liberty. Their resistance was so strong, Parliament eventually repealed the Stamp Act. But Britain wasn't ready to give up control. Parliament doubled down, passing new taxes on glass, lead, paint, and most famously tea, items colonists used every day. Tensions exploded in Boston, where protests turned deadly in the Boston Massacre. 5 colonists were killed by British soldiers, shocking the colonies and fueling outrage. The Boston Tea Party soon followed. Disguised as Native Americans, colonists dumped 342 chests of British tea into the harbor, protesting not the price, but the principle of being taxed without consent. Britain saw this as open defiance and responded with harsh punishments, determined to reassert its authority. The message from the colonies was clear. They weren't backing down, and their resolve only grew stronger. Each new tax and crackdown only united the colonies further, forging a sense of shared purpose and identity. The argument was no longer just about money. It was about rights, respect, and the fundamental question of self-government: who should decide the fate of the colonies? The stage was set for a full-blown confrontation, as both sides dug in and prepared for what was coming. The breakup was getting serious, and the world was about to witness a revolution. After the Tea Party, Britain hit back with the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor and stripping Massachusetts of self-rule. Instead of scaring the colonies, these acts united them. 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, demanding their rights. Britain's answer? Rebellion. Militias began drilling, tensions soared. In April 1775, British troops marched to seize weapons in Concord. Paul Revere and others spread the alarm: the British are coming. At Lexington, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired first. The skirmish left 8 colonists dead. The British retreated under fire all the way back to Boston. The war had begun. There was no turning back. The colonies were now fighting for their future. The first major clash of the American Revolution was the Battle of Bunker Hill, a name that's a bit misleading since most of the fighting actually took place on nearby Breed's Hill, not Bunker Hill itself. The British technically won the battle, but their victory came at a staggering price. Over 1,000 casualties, far more than the Americans suffered. This brutal fight proved to the world that the colonists were no pushovers, and that they could stand toe-to-toe with the mighty British Army. Soon after, George Washington arrived to take command of the ragtag Continental Army, facing the daunting task of turning a group of untrained volunteers into a real fighting force. Supplies were short, discipline was shaky, and defeat seemed likely. Early on, the Americans suffered a string of defeats, especially in New York and the surrounding areas, forcing them into desperate retreats. But in a bold move, Washington led a daring surprise attack at Trenton on Christmas night, catching the enemy off guard and giving the battered army a much-needed boost in morale. The real turning point came at Saratoga, where American forces managed to surround and defeat a British army, changing the course of the war. This stunning victory shocked Europe and proved the Americans could win on the battlefield. It was enough to convince France to officially join the fight, bringing not just money and weapons but also a powerful navy. The British, hoping to rally loyalist support, shifted their focus to the southern colonies but soon found themselves bogged down by fierce resistance and difficult terrain. General Cornwallis, leading the British Southern campaign, made a fatal mistake by moving his army to Yorktown, Virginia. There he became trapped, unable to escape by land or sea. Washington and his French allies closed in, surrounding Yorktown and bombarding the British, until Cornwallis finally surrendered in 1781. With that, the fighting was effectively over, and the British defeat was undeniable. Against all odds, the Americans had pulled off the impossible. The world watched in amazement as a new nation was born from revolution. The revolution had changed everything, shattering old ideas about power and government. But now, the real challenge loomed ahead, building a nation from scratch and turning revolutionary ideals into reality. On one side, King George III, stubborn, distant, convinced he was right. He saw the colonies as rebellious children, not partners. His refusal to compromise fueled the conflict. On the other side, George Washington, steady, resilient, and inspiring. Washington wasn't a military genius, but he kept the army together through disaster and doubt. He led by example, sharing hardships with his men. King George managed the war from afar, relying on slow news and bickering generals. Washington was on the ground, adapting to every challenge. The contrast was stark, a distant monarch versus a leader who earned loyalty. Washington's leadership made the difference. The revolution's outcome was shaped by these two men. In the end, it was Washington's steady hand that prevailed. The revolution wasn't just generals and famous names. Ordinary people, farmers, blacksmiths, fishermen, made up the Continental Army. They endured hunger, disease, and brutal conditions. Women kept the economy running, managed farms, and even joined the fight. Some, like Deborah Sampson, disguised themselves as men to serve. Spies risked everything to gather intelligence. Black Americans faced impossible choices: fight for the British, who promised freedom, or for the Americans, hoping for liberty. Many fought bravely, though freedom was far from guaranteed. The real work of revolution was done by these unsung heroes. Their sacrifices made independence possible. The founders debated, but everyday people made the revolution real. Their stories are the heart of America's messy beginning. Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown signaled victory, but the war wasn't officially over. The British still held key cities, but support for the war collapsed in London. Peace talks began in Paris, led by Franklin, Adams, and Jay. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized American independence and granted huge territory. Winning the war was just the start. The new nation was broke and divided, with a weak government under the Articles of Confederation. The post-war years were chaotic and uncertain. Realizing they needed a better system, the founders met again in 1787. The result, the United States Constitution, a stronger government, but with checks on power. The Constitution was the final piece of the revolution. Independence was won on the battlefield. But the real nation was built in the aftermath. America's messy, complicated story had only just begun.